Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Winter and spring are battling it out here in Grand Rapids, but in spite of the weather, it's always wonderful to be with you. My name is Scott St. Louis, and I have the privilege of serving as program manager for the Common Ground Initiative in the Hauenstein Center right here at Grand Valley State University. To our partners at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, we thank you for all of your hard work in making ours the best partnership in the country between a Presidential Studies Center and a National Archives facility, as our director, Gleaves Whitney, often says. To Brian Hauenstein, to members of the Grand Valley Board of Trustees and senior management team, to President Emeritus Don and Nancy Lubbers, to Peter and Joan Secchia, and to every supporter of the Hauenstein Center, we are likewise grateful for your committed stewardship of the civic institutions that make West Michigan a lovely place to live, rain or shine. Let's have a round of applause. As many of you know, the Hauenstein Center has three important roles. We are a Presidential Studies Center, we are home to the Common Ground Initiative, and we are a Center for Leadership Excellence. Named after one of Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein's closest friends, our Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy is a vital component of advancing Ralph's vision for ethical, effective leadership in the 21st century. The Academy is currently providing more than 60 student fellows with rigorous educational and professional development opportunities on campus and all around the world. We enjoy sharing the stage with our fellows at these events. Time and again, they do a wonderful job of sharing with us what the Hauenstein Center has meant to them. This tradition is called the Leadership Minute, and tonight's Leadership Minute will be given by Kelly Hoffman. Please help me welcome Kelly.
My name is Kelly Hoffman, and I am a Cook Leadership Academy Fellow. As a third-year resident assistant for Grand Valley Housing, I have gained substantial leadership experience. I have facilitated intergroup dialogue, created community programming, and worked for a department dedicated to inclusion and equity, but I did not want to stop there. Following the pleasant surprise of being nominated by a trusted mentor, I joined the Academy to continue to grow as a leader. The self-reflections and extra opportunities like Speak Up and Be Effective have equipped me with invaluable tools with which to move forward. Through committed mentors and goal-oriented workshops, the Academy has encouraged me to be a leader who listens first, who practices empathy, and who empowers people to share their voices. After graduation, I hope to work in the legal field and earn a JD with a focus on immigration law. My name is Kelly Hoffman, and I am a leader. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. You do us proud. I want to welcome this audience and also our C-SPAN viewers. Let me say the obvious, if you'll bear with it. The Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies exists because of Ralph Hauenstein. And we honor Ralph in every program that we put on, and we take pride in his legacy of leadership and service, as Scott just mentioned, and also in recalling his irrepressible sense of humor. Ralph was often the funniest guy in the room, and I just wanted to share with you, as he was approaching the century mark, he was often asked by people. Everybody wanted the elixir of life. They'd come to Ralph and they would say, "What's your secret? How do you do this?" And he would always come back. He had that quick wit, and he was adamant. He'd say, "Don't eat organic food." He said, "When you're my age, you need all the preservatives you can get." You laughed, and that's a good thing, because for Ralph, that was one of the keys to staying young, is for all of us. And so we remember Ralph and we enjoy Ralph, especially on a program like tonight where Bill Brantz will be talking about humor. Ralph would want us to remember to laugh, but we're also pretty serious at the Hauenstein Center because we have serious business to do in these times. We live in very challenging times. So we do three things. I think that Scott went over them very ably, very quickly, but I just want to reiterate, we're a Presidential Studies Center that seeks to generate and disseminate knowledge, understanding, even wisdom about the forces and the personalities of people who've been in the most powerful office in the world. So we disseminate that. Second, we're the Common Ground Initiative, which promotes civic dialogue in search of the common good. And third, we are the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. You just saw a wonderful representative in Kelly. And what we try to do there is these 60 to 70 young leaders is to grow them into becoming thinking leaders and leading thinkers. Now, there are very few speakers who I would invite to this podium or to this stage, as you'll see. Bill doesn't use podiums. Very few speakers that I would invite who has a wingspan adequate to cover all three of those areas. Bill Brands is, I almost look at you as a triathlete among historians because you do fulfill all three functions that we have at the Hauenstein Center. For example, in the area of presidential studies, look at Bill's signal achievements again and again and again. I think you write a book every year. And if you want to know about presidents, Andrew Jackson, Ulysses Grant, if you go into the 20th century, TR, FDR, you've got Truman, and you've got Eisenhower. He's written about Johnson. He's, in a variety of venues, he has written about these leading presidents and the way they have shaped America and our institutions. So Bill's one of the best in the business if you want to read these really good works. He's such an approachable writer. When it comes to helping Americans find common ground, Bill's also great at that. And I have just stolen wholesale his ability to talk to large audiences. And he's got a technique that I really find very helpful. So if Bill senses that an audience like you are liberal, he will tack right. He will go in the conservative direction. Just to irritate, just to be a burr under your saddle. If he senses that you're conservative, he'll tack left. Again, the idea is to broaden your perspective, and that's the most important starting place for common ground. And then when it comes to leadership development, I've got to say, and I've been telling Bill this for 15 years now, we've had Bill come back year after year after year. Bill, it's been 15 years, I think. And the reason we do is that Bill is the most accessible of all the speakers we have. And most importantly, he's the most accessible to students. And that's ultimately what we're about. We're about the students who come to Grand Valley and to the Cook Leadership Academy and take part in the Hauenstein Center programs. That accessibility is wonderful, and you can see it. I mean, if you've interacted with Bill, it's contagious. Then you want to go back to the books, and for example, if you want to read about the relationship between MacArthur and Truman, you've got a book that Bill's written. If you want to, understand better how people in Congress work, well, Bill's got a book that's available for purchase and for his autograph after this program, The Eras of the Founders. It's a very serious and important book and a very timely and needed book in our age. Well, this evening, Bill is going to share with us, I think, a really intriguing idea. This idea of humor, it's more than ha-ha. Humor is actually a way that unites presidential studies with common ground, because humor breaks down barriers, with leadership. Often, when a leader needs to be self-deprecating, for example, the invocation of humor will be very good. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoy this evening's event. I think you will find it amusing as well as enlightening. Please join me in welcoming Bill Brands.
I'm delighted to be back, and I'm delighted to see some familiar faces, many familiar faces. I have to say that does give me a little bit of pause, especially given the topic I'm going to be speaking about tonight. But before I get there, I have to say that I need, as I always do, to commend Gleaves and Scott and the staff of the Hauenstein Center. Because over the years, and I haven't been here since the very beginning, but I've seen a lot of the development of the Hauenstein Center. And from the beginning, it was one of the, and now it has become the premier institution for the study of the presidency. But one of the most gratifying things to me as an educator is how it's branched out into leadership studies, into the Common Ground Initiative. And this, to me, is a model of what public universities should be doing. So those of us who are on the faculty, on the teaching side, I teach, and I write, and I speak to groups like this. But centers like the Hauenstein Center are able to do things that don't fit into either one of those particular model specifically into the writing or into the classroom. It's bringing people like you together. People who, well, most of you are not in a position to be in a classroom and sign up for a class, but you're interested in this kind of work. You're interested in what makes this country the country that it's become. And so I cannot say enough good things about the Hauenstein Center, about all the people who've made the Hauenstein Center possible through their donations, through their support, and through the good work they've done over the years. And I am most flattered and honored to be back again. So I'm going to talk about a subject that I thought we need a little bit of. Gleaves asked me last fall, so what would you like to talk about? He always invites me to come in the dead of winter because President's Day falls in February. And we've been talking about either getting Congress or somebody to move President's Day, or we'll just sort of do it ourselves in a de facto sense. But I'm particularly flattered that you all came out on a nasty night like tonight. So thank you. Now, the reason I said it gave me some pause to see all of the familiar faces, and that is because I'm going to tell parts of my story that you will have heard before. But I'll tell you, and maybe you'll have the same reaction. At the University of Texas, I speak regularly to some of the continuing education programs they have. And the people who attend are mostly retired folks. And I would say that at the average age of audiences, I just spoke at one a couple of days ago, the average age of audiences is probably 75 or so. And there are several of these programs, and I speak to them often, to several of them in the course of a year. And I confess to them, that I don't always keep straight what I told to which group. And so there was one session a few years ago where I said this, and I said, now, I don't remember exactly what I might have told you, so forgive me if I repeat myself. And at that point, a silver-haired gentleman in the back stood up, and he said, Sonny, if you don't remember, we sure as heck don't. So, now you, of course, are much younger than this group. But maybe you'll grant me a little bit of that leeway if you've heard some of these stories before. But so Gleaves asked me what I wanted to talk about. And I was at a bit of a loss because typically I talk about the book that I've just published. I get on a roll flogging the book, and I've been on a book tour. But Gleaves got out ahead of this last year because he asked me to talk about the book that was coming up. It's very clever in this regard because he gets a scoop on on everybody else and on what is going to be published and be said. So I haven't published a new book since I talked about my book. It's called Heirs of the Founders, and it's available for $30 after the session. You will not want to leave and go home without it. So I had to think of something else. And this is a subject I'm going to be talking about, well, sort of humor in the White House. And as I was thinking of this title, I realized, this is a potential problem, because I was really talking about the presidents and jokes and humor. And I know enough about the history of the presidency, and some of you perhaps will have caught on to this. There's a potential problem there. There were two presidents who served before the White House was the official residence of the president. And so if I wanted to say, well, the presidency in humor in the White House didn't quite do it. But then I thought about it some more, and actually, it does work, because neither of the first two presidents had a sense of humor. So it gets me out of that problem. But I'm going to follow the lead of perhaps the most successful humorist in the White House. It might not be the person that you're thinking of, by doing what he always did, or in most cases what he did at the beginning of a talk. He started with a joke. Now again, some of you will have heard this joke, but please pretend you haven't heard it before and laugh at the appropriate point. So this is a joke, and this is a key to part of my story, that Ronald Reagan used to tell. And the key is, as you'll see, Ronald Reagan was effectively telling this story on himself. It related to a time in his career when he didn't know sort of what he was doing or where he was going. As you will know of Ronald Reagan, he had two careers primarily. He was a film actor, and then he became a politician. But there was an interregnum, a period between the time, basically after he stopped getting calls from Hollywood producers. He couldn't get any good roles. Between when his career ended and his political career, his film career ended and his political career began. And he had, well, a rather unusual position. In fact, it was a job that was invented for him by the General Electric Corporation. General Electric at the time was the great industrial behemoth of the American economy. And Reagan was their paid spokesman. And he was a host, a television host for the GE Theater. And the GE Theater was, well, it was an experiment in television. This is in the 1950s. And nobody knows quite what to do with TV. And so they think, well, what you do with a television camera is you film plays. And then people just watch plays on TV. So Reagan was the host. He wasn't the star. He was in a couple of these, but he mostly just introduced them. And then the show went on. That's what he would do on weekends. During the week, he would travel the country giving speeches on behalf of General Electric and the glories and wonders and conveniences of electricity. Better living through electricity. This is what he would do. And he would find himself, because Reagan in that phase of his life was afraid to fly. And he had written into his contract that he would not fly. And so he traveled by train across the country. And he would go through small towns, and very often he would find himself addressing the local Rotary Club, or the Elks, or the Chamber of Commerce. And he used to call, as other people have, the rubber chicken circuit. And he would find himself in these small towns where people didn't know who he was because he wasn't famous. He was never sort of an A-list actor. He was sort of the B-list actor. As Jack Warner, his boss at Warner Brothers, said when he heard that Reagan was running for president of the is running for governor of California in the 1960s, he said, no, Jimmy Stewart for governor, Reagan for best friend. And that was the kind of roles he played. So anyway, he's this relative non-entity, and he's going to these rather obscure towns and giving these sort of standard talks. So the story that Reagan told went like this. He is about to give a talk in some small town in the Midwest. And he doesn't know the people he's going to be speaking to. It's been lined up by his publicity agent. And so he's going to address this group. And one of the locals, the program director of whatever club it was, we'll call it the Elks, is going to introduce Reagan. But the thing is that the program director isn't familiar with Ronald Reagan, and he simply sees the printed name, Ronald, R-E-A-G-A-N, on the program. And he's supposed to introduce him and act like he knows something about him. But the problem is that he doesn't know how the last name, R-E-A-G-A-N, is supposed to be pronounced. It could be Reagan. It could be Regan. And people of Irish background pronounce it both ways. So this man is in a quandary. Now, this is back in the 1950s. You know, today you could just go on YouTube and somebody would be introducing him and you hear how it was pronounced. Now, you couldn't do it then. So this guy, and he's pretty conscientious. He wants to get it right. He doesn't want to embarrass his guest. He doesn't want to embarrass his group. So he's trying to figure out how he's going to resolve this problem, how he's going to discover how the name is pronounced. So he's deep in thought on the morning before the talk. And it's a small town, and he's walking around like this through one of the neighborhoods, and just, oh, no. And while he's walking, he encounters one of his neighbors. The neighbor's out walking his dog. And in fact, so this guy actually doesn't encounter the neighbor. He actually trips over the dog. And it's, oh. And the neighbor says, well, Joe, boy, you really look like you're worried. What's going on? And Joe starts to say, well, he explains the deal. And he's starting to say, so he reaches in his pocket and he pulls out the program. And he says, do you know this guy? You ever heard of this guy? How do I pronounce his name? And he looks at, oh, it's Ronald Reagan. Yeah, he used to be an actor. And Joe says, so you're sure it's Reagan? Yeah, it's Reagan. You say Reagan, you'll be fine. There's, oh boy, thanks. You've lifted a huge load off of my shoulders. And he starts walking back, and he repeats himself, Reagan. And as he's walking back, he again trips over the dog. And he looks down there and says, that's a cute dog. What kind of dog is it? A bagel. So this is Ronald Reagan's approach. And it characterizes sort of a large part of where I'm going to be going with my talk. Because by the time Reagan was president, humor was considered a necessary part of the political arsenal of a president, of a candidate. And this because, well, I told you this story, and no one would say it's an enormously clever story, but it's enough to get a ha-ha-ha a little bit. Reagan recognized from those years on the rubber chicken circuit that if there's an audience that doesn't know you, if there's an audience that might be a little bit skeptical about the message that you're conveying, if you can get them to laugh, it loosens them up. It makes them feel that you're a real person and not simply this flack for GE. And it worked for Reagan and GE. It worked for Reagan as governor, for Reagan as president of the United States. And it represented something of a culmination of a trend that had been going on for a long period of time. So I'm going to cover some of that trend. Now, after I told Gleaves what the topic was going to be tonight, I sort of got to thinking about it a little bit more. And I happen to be teaching as of, this January, so just last month, a course. I teach this course every other year. And it's a course on the history of the presidency. And it's standard for me to begin the course with, I put up on a screen like this, I put an image, an illustration, in this case a portrait, of our first president and our current president. And I've been teaching it long enough that I go back to this course, back to George W. Bush. And so our first president, our current president, and underneath the one word, explain. And so this is the theme of the course. This is what the students actually have to do on their final exam. How did we get from George Washington to George W. Bush? How did we get from George Washington to Barack Obama? How did we get from George Washington to Donald Trump? Now, one of the striking things is that if you go from George Washington to most presidents before the current president, you see a kind of linear progression. Now, some people would think that it's a decline, that the curve slopes down. In fact, this question of this comparison between the first president and the current president goes all the way back to the second president. Presidents always look better in the rearview mirror than they do when they're right front and center. Part of this is that we tend to, we sort of tend to forget the failures and remember the successes. That's part of it. The other thing is that presidents are usually pretty talented people. And so they usually have a lot of positive things that can be said about them. But while they're president, typically the other party, or sometimes factions with their own party, have an incentive to tell you all the bad things about them. But once they leave office, that incentive is largely gone. This is why certain presidents fool themselves into thinking, I could have run for a third term. Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was more popular by polling at the end of his presidency than he was at the beginning of his presidency. And he used to think, boy, I could have gotten a third term. Bill Clinton was more popular in the year 2000 than he was in the year 1993. He used to think that, okay, if he could have run for a third term, he would have won. They fool themselves because by 1960, the Democrats had no incentive to go after Dwight Eisenhower. They were focusing all their fire on the next one, Richard Nixon. The Republicans in 2000 had no particular reason to go after Bill Clinton anymore. He got a free pass. They were aiming their guns at Al Gore. So this question of sort of popularity and how presidents look better in the rearview mirror is partly due to this artifact of nobody sniping at them anymore. Whereas while they're in office, everybody is, and you learn all the bad stuff about them. But perhaps the clearest statement, the clearest assertion of presidential decline was made by Henry Adams, who was an observer of presidents he was the grandson of John Adams. And so he was the great-grandson of John Adams and the grandson of John Quincy Adams. Henry Adams, he had brothers. And the Adams family was in this state of political decline where there were two Adams' presidents in their background, but Henry Adams couldn't make even a start in politics. But Henry Adams became a very distinguished historian, and when he was writing in the 1860s, late 1860s and early 1870s, when Ulysses Grant was president, and this was just 10 years after the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, the introduction of the theory of evolution. And Adams's take on this was that anybody who looks at the progression of the presidency from George Washington to Ulysses Grant understands that evolution is a crock, that it utterly refutes the theory. Anyway, but I am going to start, I was going to say that, in most cases, it looks as though there's this linear line. There's this line that maybe you think it goes down, maybe you think it goes up. But in George Washington, it's a tough act to follow. But there's a striking thing, at least, I'm going to propose this to you, and you can decide whether you agree with this or not. There is one sense at least, in which Donald Trump is positively, and this is an adjective that I haven't heard applied to Donald Trump, that Donald Trump is positively Washingtonian. He is very much like the father of our country. And do you know what? Can you guess what I'm going to say is that particular characteristic? Yeah, 6'3", that's not too bad. All right. Well, okay. So I hear it in the front, but I'm not going to advertise it just yet. You all know the story, and well, I don't know if you all know this, but it's part of American historical lore that George Washington, you know the story about George Washington and the cherry tree, and how he chopped down the cherry tree, and his father said, who chopped down the cherry tree, and said, I cannot tell a lie, I chopped it down with my axe, and so on. So we have this impression that George Washington couldn't tell a lie. I don't actually think that's true. I've read enough of Washington's diary and letters to know that he fudged the truth. But if whether or not George Washington couldn't tell a lie, he could not tell a joke. And he couldn't tell a joke, or maybe it's just that he wouldn't tell a joke, nor would he laugh at jokes. And this in part because he self-consciously presented himself to the world as this very sober-minded, serious character. As a young man, he got a hold of this list of sort of maxims and principles of life for a young man. There's something like 110 of them. And one of them said, laugh seldom and never in distinguished company. He wrote this down. And these were words that he came to live by. Now, I really don't know if in his private life, George Washington, I don't think he told jokes. He might have laughed at jokes. But in his public life, he certainly did not. And people would try to warm him up. There's a story that is told on good authority about George Washington at the Constitutional Convention. This is before he's president, but he's actually president of the convention. And he is this austere figure. He's the commander of the Continental Army. He's the one who won the Revolutionary War and therefore the independence for the United States. And he's presiding over the Constitutional Convention. And he was chosen in part because he was this very straight-laced, sober-minded individual. He also wouldn't say much. It was known that he wouldn't participate in the debates. And you make him president, the presiding officer, and that gives him an excuse not to. But some of the other members of the convention, one in particular, Gouverneur Morris, he had lived different times in New York and Pennsylvania, and he was a delegate to the convention from Pennsylvania. And he was very much a hail fellow, well-met type. And he walked on a wooden leg. And the story that was sometimes told about him, he liked to tell the story, that he had lost his leg in the Revolutionary War. It was a battle injury. The other story that was told about him is that he badly injured himself diving out of the bedroom window of one of his lovers just at the moment that her husband was returning home. And it was badly set and the leg had to be amputated. Anyway, Gouverneur Morris was one who wanted this convention to be, well, not quite as somber as it seemed to be. So he made a bet with some of his friends there, including Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton led the other side. And Hamilton knew Washington better than Morris did. And so he made this bet that he could actually loosen up George Washington. And so Hamilton said, you got a bet. What do you want the wager to be? It'll be the finest dinner in Philadelphia for a dozen of each of our friends. So if I win, then you treat us. If you win, I treat you. So he goes up to George Washington, and this is at a break in the gathering, and he slaps George Washington on the shoulder, puts his arm around, and says, George, how you doing? Glad to see you. And the way Gouverneur Morris tells the story, he said, at that moment, General Washington fixed me with an icy glare. And he took my hand and lifted it off his shoulder and fixed me with that gaze. And all I could think about was, how can I get out of this room as quickly as possible? That was George Washington. And that was the kind of person Americans expected as their president. That's the kind of person Americans wanted as their president in the early days of the Republic. In what I call the Augustan age of the American presidency, an age that runs from George Washington up through John Quincy Adams, before the United States became a democracy, that is, a system in which ordinary people actually exercise political power. Ordinary people did not elect George Washington. Ordinary people, for the most part, did not even elect the electors who chose George Washington. According to the Constitution, and there are copies that the Hauenstein Center is giving away out there, you'll read that each state shall select electors. And it doesn't say how. They get to choose. The legislatures of the states get to choose how the electors are chosen. And until as late as the 1820s, most state legislatures chose the electors, not voters in the state. And in that era, Americans expected their president to stand above them. No one wanted George Washington to be just one of the gang. And this is why Washington could get away with giving that reaction to Gouverneur Morris, because it really served his purposes to be this one who held himself apart from everybody else, because that's what Americans wanted. And the idea that the presidency, when he became president, the presidency was a serious undertaking. And the idea that your president should have a sense of humor, that laugh and laugh, especially in any kind of public setting, this just clashed with the idea that politics is a serious business. Governing this country is a serious business. And so you're really hard-pressed to find a sense of humor, to find anybody in the White House telling jokes, really before about Andrew Jackson, who's elected in 1828. Even with Andrew Jackson, it's a little bit hard to find anything that looks like modern humor. And I took up this subject, understanding that conveying jokes or humor from the past to the present is a difficult undertaking, because tastes change. And perhaps you've heard the saying of Thelonious Monk that writing about music is like dancing about architecture. Well, it's a little bit like that. To translate, you'll see, to translate humor from the past to the present, something is lost in the translation, but I'm going to try anyway. And I think you look like a learned audience. So I think you're going to be able to get this one. Andrew Jackson is the first really popularly elected president. He's the one who makes the presidency preeminently the people's office. And his election appalled members of the establishment, members of, well, the Adams family, and supporters of all those presidents who had come from the elite, from the American aristocracy. He was the first real common man to be president. And especially in places like New England, around Boston, around Harvard College, the idea that this unlettered Westerner, this uncouth militarist, should be president of the United States was something they had a really hard time getting their heads around. And John Quincy Adams, who was defeated by Jackson in 1828 and went back to Massachusetts to lick his wounds and to really fret over the future of the Republic. If this is the kind of person the presidency attracts, there is no hope. Well, there were people in New England, there were people at Harvard who took a different view. This is the way the world is going. We have to make our peace with it. And so the Board of Trustees of Harvard decided that in the interest of holding out an olive branch, they were going to offer to President Jackson an honorary Harvard degree. John Quincy Adams almost had a fit. And he wrote to the president of Harvard saying, "You can't do this. It will sully the reputation of my dear alma mater." But the occasion went forward. There were dissenters on the faculty. And they decided, okay, we can't stop this, but we will show Jackson up. In those days, it was not unheard of, and it was still accepted practice on certain occasions, for academics to give their addresses, to deliver their papers in Latin, the traditional language of intellectuals in the academy. And so, without telling the president of the university, whose reputation was on the line here, what they were going to do, say, okay, sure, I'll be happy to speak on this occasion. And it was a commencement, and so there were several speeches. And the speakers before Jackson stood up and gave their speeches in Latin, with the belief that this would really flummox Jackson. He obviously would not know what was happening and would be so embarrassed that he would be humiliated and it would be shown up, and that would be the end of it. Now, as I say, with explaining these historical stories, context is necessary. This was at a moment when Jackson was holding the Union together by main force. South Carolina was threatening to secede from the Union over a tariff that it didn't like. And Jackson was asserting, no, the Union is central. The Union must hold. So this is the background. And everybody is waiting to hear what the president is going to say. Jackson was the first of presidents, and this became a fairly common thing over the years, for presidents and other distinguished members of the government, secretaries of state. The Marshall Plan, for example, was announced in a Harvard commencement address. So Jackson is going to give this pronouncement on the current state. And he's also going to deal with this attempt by the Harvard faculty to embarrass him. So Jackson stands up and he says, "E pluribus unum, sine qua non," and sat down. All right, enough of you know your Latin to get the joke. So anyway, that's the best I've got on a joke from Jackson. And I have to confess that that story is probably somewhat exaggerated. It's in the nature of, Jackson wasn't a particularly funny guy, but one of the things that you see in the evolution of the presidency is not always that the presidents are the ones telling the jokes or telling the stories, but the president becomes the object, sometimes the butt of the stories and the jokes, in a way that wasn't true. It really was considered sort of lèse majesté with somebody like George Washington to tell things like that. But with Jackson, things are fair game. The office of the presidency evolves until somebody like, well, the next really sort of ordinary person to get elected president is Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln is perhaps the most famous, what shall I say, humorist in the White House. And Lincoln was known for, and this is key, and you'll see a connection here between Lincoln and Ronald Reagan. Lincoln told stories. He told jokes. But he realized that in politics, when you tell jokes, jokes often have a target, the person who's being joked about or being teased. And Lincoln understood that in politics, in democratic politics, politics where you're asking for votes, the only safe target of a joke is you yourself. If you target anybody else, well, you're going to alienate them and their friends and people who feel an affinity toward them. If you tell a joke about yourself, the first good thing happens is that you avoid that. And the second thing is you make people think, he doesn't have a big ego. He can tell jokes about himself. It humanizes these presidents for people. And we see the beginning of a trend that would set in really in full in the 20th century, where by the 20th century, certainly by the second half of the 20th century, if you had to figure out who is going to win any election, any given election, you can look at things like unemployment rates, and you can look at political platforms, and you can look at other things. But the most reliable single indicator is what you could generically call a likability index. Which of the candidates would you rather sit down and have a beer with? And if there's a clear difference between the two candidates, that candidate is likely to win. Well, with Lincoln, this business of likability, we see it for the first time, and Lincoln really needs to make himself likable. He also did have a certain wit. And not everybody is blessed with the kind of wit that can sort of turn a particular situation in a humorous direction. But this is a story told about Lincoln, but you'll see that Lincoln has the punchline. So Lincoln, before he went into politics, and after his sojourn in the House of Representatives in the 1840s, was a practicing lawyer. And lawyers in Springfield, Illinois, to make a living, they had to ride the circuit with the judges. There wasn't enough business in Springfield itself. So they would go out, and there was all sorts of people who were lawyers. They could start young, and they would hang on till they were old. And Lincoln had a lawyer friend, or maybe a lawyer acquaintance, who was a relatively young man. And things were kind of slow in this day, or more precisely, there was a recess in this guy was having a trial. He was conducting a trial. He was one of the attorneys in the trial. And so there's a recess. And this guy is young and full of energy, and he considered himself something of an athlete, in fact, a wrestler. And so he got in a wrestling match just during the lunch break with this other guy, this townsperson. And they're wrestling, and they're rolling around on the ground. And this guy rips his pants. And so the judge is back, the trial continues. And he stands up before the court, and as he turns to address the jury, it's really clear he's got this big hole in the bottom of his pants. And so the other members of the bar who were sitting around, unbeknownst to the guy, they decide to take up a contribution to buy him a new pair of pants. And they silently send this subscription sheet around the courtroom. And it comes to Lincoln. And Lincoln was always rather thrifty with his money. And he didn't want to give any money away for causes that didn't require it. And so he declined to contribute. And he just wrote instead, "I cannot contribute to the end in view." So, when Lincoln would introduce himself to audiences, in one of his sort of coming out speeches for the new Republican Party, Lincoln began his political life as a Whig, but the Whig Party declined early in his career, and it was replaced by the Republican Party. And the Republicans held their first convention in Illinois, at Bloomington, Illinois. And Lincoln attended. And he wasn't that well known. He was somewhat known, but he needed to introduce himself to the group there. And so he began by saying that when he was riding his horse to the convention, he encountered a woman on the road who was coming the other way. And the woman stopped him and said, "Sir, I believe you are the ugliest man I have ever seen." And Lincoln says, well, I responded, what could I say? I said, well, this is the way God made me, and sorry, but I don't have an excuse for that. And she said, well, okay, but the least you could do is have stayed home. So, on another occasion, Lincoln sort of, what shall I say, lampooned his appearance when one of his political opponents described him as two-faced. And Lincoln said, "Two-faced? You got to be kidding. You think if I had another one, I'd wear this one?" Lincoln used humor to warm up audiences, but he also used humor to get him through the dark days of the Civil War. The members of Lincoln's cabinet very often groaned when Lincoln would start to tell a story, because they knew these stories would go on, and there was business to be done. And sometimes the stories had a point, a moral. For example, at the end of the Civil War, when Jefferson Davis was on the run, and nobody could quite figure out what to do with him, Lincoln did not want to try him for treason. Lincoln wished that the Davis problem would simply go away. Lincoln was all in favor of a very speedy and lenient Reconstruction. But he had to have sort of some policy about what to do with Confederate leaders. And so he was asked, Mr. President, what should we do? And Lincoln said, well, it brings me in mind of this Baptist that I used to know. And this Baptist was quite opposed to the use of any alcoholic beverages. He would not go near the stuff. But he came down with a fever. And his doctor prescribed a certain dram of whiskey once a day. And the Baptist couldn't decide whether to follow his conscience or the doctor's orders. But the Baptist finally concluded, he came up with a solution. And so he told his wife, he said, there's a punch bowl over there, and if unbeknownst to me, you could slip a little bit of that whiskey into the punch, then I could drink it in good conscience and all would be well. Well, says Lincoln, if somehow Mr. Davis could slip out of the country unbeknownst to me, then much of our problem would go away. The institution of the presidency changed dramatically at the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century. Through the 19th century, the president and the presidency were not at the center of American political life. They were not expected to be. By the Constitution, Congress was supposed to be the leading institution. The president was simply the chief executive. He would execute the will of Congress. And most presidents of the 19th century followed that model. There are only a couple, really, of 19th century presidents that people remember. Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, maybe, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson if you like him. James Polk has his fan club. But for the most part, presidents of the 19th century are unmemorable by design. But things change in the 20th century when and because the United States for the first time has a full-time foreign policy. I've written about 19th century presidents, and when I write about a presidency, I sort of have this idea, because I started writing history in the 20th century about Dwight Eisenhower's presidency, and so I think that there's got to be a lot on foreign policy. So when I was writing about Andrew Jackson, when I was writing about Ulysses Grant, I think, well, there's got to be at least a chapter on foreign policy, but there's really not that much foreign policy. It's only in the 20th century, when the United States becomes a world power, that the United States has a full-time foreign policy, and then the president has to take charge. The president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and he's the de facto diplomat-in-chief for relations with foreign countries. And it's in the 20th century that the presidency takes center stage in American politics, where it remains. And so the presidency rewarded people who had these big personalities, these people, the kind of people who would arrest your attention when you walked in the room. The first president to fit that mold, the one who really set the model for modern presidents, was Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt was one who really did sort of take up all the air in a room when he came in. And his daughter Alice, who had some of this in herself, and who knew her father very well, said, if you want to understand my father, you have to remember that he has to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. and so this is Theodore Roosevelt. The odd thing is, and maybe this isn't so odd given that sort of personality, but Roosevelt could not appreciate jokes told at his expense. Roosevelt himself didn't tell jokes, but most presidents eventually would get to the point where they would learn to laugh when people made jokes about them, because that was the easiest way of dealing with it. Roosevelt had to train himself to do this. There was one moment when Theodore Roosevelt considered his most important accomplishment as president to be getting the Panama Canal under construction. This was his contribution to world history, he said. Well, to get it going, Roosevelt essentially had to foment a revolution in Panama to break Panama free of Colombia. And under international law, or even ordinary codes of ethics, it was highly problematic. But Roosevelt convened a cabinet session to basically convince everybody in the cabinet that he had done the right thing. And so after he gave this long explanation as to why it needed to be done and how it was just the right terms, his attorney general, a guy named Philander Knox, stood up and said, Mr. President, really, you should not let such a great accomplishment as this be tainted by any whiff of legality. Roosevelt didn't laugh. The other members of the cabinet did. But I have to give Roosevelt credit for this. Roosevelt was one of the first presidents to be the target of other people's humor in a particular form, editorial cartoons. And editorial cartoonists had a field day with Roosevelt because he had features that were easily caricatured. He had the glasses, he had the mustache, he was always sort of just full of himself and saying bully and delighted. And there were various cartoonists who would skewer Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, either to his credit or maybe to his shrewdness, would respond by writing a letter to the cartoonist, the person who wrote the cartoon, and said, "Oh, I got a great laugh out of it," which he didn't. And he said, "And I liked it so much, could you send me the original?" Now, nobody ever knew what happened to the originals, but it was his way. He understood that he needed to do this, even though it came hard. The presidency would continue to evolve, and the biggest evolution of the presidency as it relates to this question of humor and how presidents portray themselves is the development of the modern mass media. And in fact, Roosevelt and those editorial cartoons, the reason that they were so popular and so effective was that Roosevelt was the first president in the age of the modern mass newspaper, of the penny press. Technological developments in the printing industry made it possible for newspapers to be printed and sold for a penny. Newspapers in the middle of the 19th century were like expensive magazines today, and ordinary people didn't read newspapers. You had to have a certain threshold of income. But by the beginning of the 20th century, everybody could read newspapers. And so the president, and this also contributes to the rise of the president as the center of American politics. Reporters can, with great difficulty, tell stories about a large group like Congress. But it's only with great difficulty. It's really tempting for reporters to tell their stories about a single individual. And if you have a charismatic, an arresting individual like Roosevelt, then it's easier to tell stories about. And so as the expectations change, as the technology changes, the system selects for those characteristics. As an aside, but it's not really an aside, one of the principles that I've gradually inferred from my study of the presidency is, sort of for better or worse, and this applies to whether you like the president or not, we get the presidents we deserve. And I say this quite literally because we chose them. Now, maybe you didn't choose this particular president or that particular president, but this is the best method anybody's come up with for selecting presidents. Basically, we have this vote. We could argue about the Electoral College. That's one of those that falls into the category, if it didn't exist, nobody would invent it today. But it does exist, and this is where we are. But anyway, so once these expectations develop for presidents, presidents adapt themselves to them, and they become the candidates who can live up to the expectations. Harry Truman was somebody who never would have been president if the only way to the White House was through the front door. But Harry Truman was one of several presidents who became president by virtue as a consequence of the death of his predecessor. And when Harry Truman became president, he told reporters, "I'm going to be as straight-talking as I ever was before I became president." And Harry Truman was a really unlikely president. He was the creature of one of the last urban political machines, the Pendergrass machine in Kansas City. And he was known primarily as a political hack. But he was loyal to Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt needed a new vice presidential running mate in 1944. Here's a reminder, sort of in telling this story and observing this story, I'm reminded how much things have changed over time in what we expect of our presidents, but also how presidents and their running mates are chosen. So we live in a time when presidents, whoever gets the nomination of the party, gets to choose, often without consulting anybody else. Consider Sarah Palin, or even Dan Quayle. without telling anybody else, this is my choice. That was not the case for most of American history. Most of American history, the presidents were told this is going to be your running mate because of the leaders of the party had the interests of the party at heart, and they needed to balance the ticket geographically and by age and by various other things. So the Democrats told Roosevelt in 1944, you got to get rid of your current vice president, Henry Wallace. It was clear that Franklin Roosevelt was not in good health. There was this real concern, especially among conservative Democrats, that Roosevelt would die in office and leave Henry Wallace, the last of the hardcore New Dealers, as president of the United States. And so they threatened a mutiny at the 1944 convention. So Roosevelt says, all right, just get that guy from Kansas City. He'd hardly met Harry Truman, but Truman became president. Anyway, so Truman becomes president. And he says that he's going to be this straight-talking guy. And he did hold press conferences, and this is actually another important part of the story. Through the Truman era, presidential press conferences, as they were called, were off-the-record events. These were for background. The president could be quoted only with his explicit permission. So when Harry Truman would hold press conferences, he would say something or other, and reporters would have to say, can we quote you on that? Nowadays, of course, we live in this age of utter transparency. If our president even says something inadvertently, it's considered fair game. Truman discovered that there were limits on his candor when he was thinking aloud, saying in the middle of the Korean War, yeah, maybe we'll use nuclear weapons. And then he said, can we quote you on that? Yeah, we can quote you. And so that makes the headlines, and the world all of a sudden is alarmed that it's going to be this nuclear war. So Truman doesn't have sort of that much in the way of sort of quotable jokes. But I'm going to share a story with you. This is Truman once he got out of the White House. He discovered that he could be freer with what he was saying. I have a very good friend who lives in Austin who grew up in Kansas City. He grew up in Kansas City in the 1950s. And he recalled visiting the Truman Library, the second of the presidential libraries, after the Franklin Roosevelt Library. And so he goes to Kansas, his school takes a field trip to the Truman Library. And my friend Greg, he's a third grader. And they're all trooping out of the bus to go into the library. And who should they see but former President Harry Truman, who lived just several blocks from the library, had an office in the library, and every morning he'd get up and he'd walk to the library. And he would talk with the people on the way. He didn't have Social Security in the way. And he would talk to the people. And so he started chatting up this group of third graders. And he said, oh, kiddies, so what do you know about history? And what do you know about politics? Truman, the last president not to have a college degree, but he prided himself on his knowledge of history because he read a lot. So he was quizzing the kids. And Truman liked to show off how much he knew about history, so he was going to quiz the third graders and demonstrate that he knew more than a third grader. But what he said was this, and my friend Greg still just shakes his head in puzzlement at this. So Greg says, the president stopped, and he said, okay, kiddies, I've got a question for you. Now, you probably know that both the House of Representatives and the Senate have various committees, and they deal with issues, and in each of the houses, there's a committee that deals with our relations with other countries. Now, in the House of Representatives, it's called the Committee on Foreign Affairs. In the Senate, it's called the Committee on Foreign Relations. Kiddies, do you know why the Senate committee is called the Committee on Foreign Relations? And Greg and the other third graders, they have no idea what to say. And Truman says, it's because senators are too old to have affairs. Anyway, so I looked for good jokes told by Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was a pretty straight-ahead guy. And the best I could come up with is Eisenhower's definition of an atheist. You know what Eisenhower's definition of an atheist is? He says, it's somebody who goes to a football game where Notre Dame plays SMU, and he doesn't care who wins. Okay. I'm running out of time. So I'm going to tell you, I got to tell you, a story about Lyndon Johnson. I've actually got a couple more Reagan stories I could tell you, but I'll tell you about Lyndon Johnson. And this is one. Lyndon Johnson, it's not at all clear that Lyndon Johnson had much of a sense of humor. So stories were told about Lyndon Johnson rather than stories told by Lyndon Johnson. But here's one that does capture the essence of Lyndon Johnson. And it's told of the 1960 Democratic campaign for the nomination for president. And Lyndon Johnson has thrown his hat in the ring. And the other two principal candidates are Stuart Symington, a senator from Missouri, and John Kennedy, a junior senator from Massachusetts. And the three men are sitting in the green room ahead of this debate. They're about to have a debate. And they're sitting in the green room. Why the green rooms are called the green rooms, I don't know. I've been in lots of them, and not one of them has been green. But nonetheless, they're sitting there. And they're making small talk. And Kennedy says, Stuart, Lyndon, I have to tell you something very strange that happened to me. I had a dream last night. And in my dream, God reached down from heaven and tapped me on the shoulder and said, Jack, you're my boy. This is your year. You are going to win the Democratic nomination. You are going to be the next president of the United States. What do you think of that? So, Stuart Symington looks at Kennedy. Symington, sort of the model of a senator, central casting in Hollywood of senator. This tall, square-jawed guy with this great mane of white hair. And he looks at the much younger Kennedy, and he looks at Johnson. He said, Jack, I don't know what to tell you. Because, you see, I had a dream last night. And in the dream, God reached down from heaven and tapped me on the shoulder. And he said, Stu, for your long and faithful service, you are going to be rewarded. You will win the Democratic nomination. You will be the next president of the United States. So Symington looks at Kennedy, looks at Johnson. Johnson looks at the other two. Now, when I tell this story to my students in Austin, where the Johnson Library is located, I ask them, how many of you have been to the Lyndon Johnson Library, which is there? And any of you by any chance been to the Lyndon Johnson Library? Okay, it's unusual among presidential libraries in greeting you before you go in is a life-size statue of Lyndon Johnson. And I invite my students to do this, for especially those who think they have ideas of a career in politics. One of the ways to determine, I think, whether you might be good at a career is to measure yourself against people who actually do that career, do that occupation. If you think you want to be a teacher, follow a teacher around. If you think you want to be an engineer, if you think you want to be a lawyer or a doctor, see what they do on a daily basis. So I tell the students who think maybe they want to go into politics, they want to be president, go over there, stand in front of that statue, look Lyndon Johnson in the eye, and see how you measure up. One of the reasons I tell them this is that the statue of Johnson is very lifelike. And some of you will have a mental image of Lyndon Johnson, but he had an unusually large head. And he had really big ears. And by this time, he had kind of jowls. And when Johnson would get sort of invested in something that he was saying, he would often shake his head. In this case, he did shake his head. And those big ears would flap a little bit. And the jowls would kind of, the waves would go on the jowls. And this is what he did. And he said, Stuart, Jack, I don't know what to tell you. Because you see, I had a dream last night, and I don't remember tapping either one of you on the shoulder. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And see if there are any responses, any questions. And so we'll see where we go. I certainly don't want to overstay my welcome. Questions? Any reactions? Yes, sir, in the back. What do I think of Saturday Night Live?
Yeah, what do you think did the best president impersonation of all?
Yeah. Okay, that's a really hard question to answer in any way that will get general assent. So a lot of it depends on how much you dislike the presidents. Because Saturday Night Live, which started airing during the presidency of Gerald Ford, and Gerald Ford was the first victim of Saturday Night Live. And Saturday Night Live really did change the context for presidential humor because it was the first regularly scheduled satire spoof on presidents. And in a certain sense, it was an equal opportunity caricaturist and satirist. And so it really didn't matter what the politics of the president were. The cast on Saturday Night Live went after whoever happened to be in the White House because their business was to get laughs and to sort of make fun of presidents. But it really did, it raised the bar for a president's ability to roll with a joke. And so Gerald Ford was quite unfairly lampooned, but in fact, lampoons are always unfair. They're a grade of exaggeration. In Ford's case, it was an entirely mischaracterization. So Chevy Chase was the one, he was part of the original cast of Saturday Night Live, and he used to do the stumble down the steps of Air Force One and pull the tablecloth off the table and do all this clumsy stuff, giving out the impression that Gerald Ford was this stumble bum, when in fact Ford was probably the best athlete, one of the most graceful individuals to occupy the White House. And Ford could have tried to dispute this characterization of him, but he was shrewd enough to realize it would have been a waste of time. So he basically grinned and bore it. But there was one particular occasion, I don't remember exactly the context, where he had a chance to make a little bit of a comeback. Now, again, this falls in the category of you might need this punchline explained, but I'm going to go with it anyway. So Chevy Chase has been lampooning Gerald Ford for some while, and the two of them meet on some particular occasion. And Chevy Chase sort of wants to let Ford know that this is all in good fun. And so he says, Gerald Ford, you are really actually a very good president. And Ford, without missing a beat, says, and you, Chevy Chase, are a very funny suburb. But I will tell you, for my money, the best presidential Saturday Night Live connection is one that goes full circle with Dana Carvey and George H.W. Bush. So Dana Carvey became famous for his characterization of Bush, and Bush's sometimes sort of telegraphic style of speech. And while Bush was president, he would smile, yeah, that's funny. So after he left the White House, he no longer had to do that. But George H.W. Bush, I had the honor and the pleasure to encounter him a few times. I used to teach at Texas A&M at the George Bush School of Public Service. And so I got to meet him. He would come to my classes, and he always struck me as one of the most decent individuals to occupy the White House. And I had no idea that he had this sense of humor and this capacity for humor. But he was this not long after he left the White House, and about the time that his presidential library was opening and school was opening at Texas A&M, he gave a closed-door address to students at Texas, closed door in the sense that the press was not allowed. And one of the things that presidents often have a hard time with, and George H.W. Bush really had this problem, when the press was around, he sort of had to act presidential. And so he often came across as kind of wooden. Lyndon Johnson had the same problem. But once he knew there were no reporters in the room and there were no cameras, he could just sort of let himself go. And he did an imitation of Dana Carvey imitating himself. And I have to tell you, this audience of students, these were undergraduates, and they had no particular opinion of George Bush one way or the other, but they were almost literally rolling in the aisles. And finally, Barbara Bush had to pull out the hook and say, get him out of here. He's not a comedian. So that's what I remember about Saturday Night Live and presidents. Other questions, reactions? Yes, okay.
So, circling back to your initial talk about the president, this president, and George Washington, I'm assuming it's like humor, lack of humor, that's the similar characteristic. So could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the striking things to me about President Trump is his, what shall I say, his lack of an observable sense of humor. And not even any attempt to fake it. I would have said before President Trump was elected, of course, I would have said a lot of things. I had very different expectations about changes in the presidency, and I sort of thought they were unrollable, that these changes were permanent. And I had to change a lot of that. But every president, really from about, well, definitely from John Kennedy, or you could say it even earlier than that, had to at least fake a sense of humor. And sometimes it meant just laughing at the jokes people told about you. Sometimes it would be telling jokes yourself. And so presidents would sort of do this sort of thing. And I assumed, and it just sort of seems logical, that if you want to get the support of people, you try to do stuff that will make you likable and make you popular. And every president did. And presidents very often, Barack Obama, for example, and often it plays into this stereotype, however false the stereotype might be. And in one of his last speeches before the National Correspondents Club, where presidents for a long time, they would give their Johnny Carson, Jay Leno monologue sort of thing. And Obama, in this case, he showed a before and after picture of him. So here he is as president, and he's got a lot of gray hair. And here he is before he becomes president. And he says, yeah, those days when I was a strapping young Muslim socialist. But Donald Trump has definitely took a different route to the White House. And I wasn't quite so surprised at the different route to the White House, because he was the ultimate of the anti-establishment candidate. And he was essentially playing into people's anger at the establishment. And Donald Trump liked to liken himself to Andrew Jackson as the anti-establishment candidate and president. I think that there's less similarity between the individuals, Trump and Jackson, than there is in the people who voted for them. In both cases, it was a rejection of this entrenched elite. And the people who voted for Andrew Jackson against John Quincy Adams were very much of the same mindset as the people who voted for Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was clearly the candidate of the establishment, and Trump was the outsider. And so the idea of sort of mobilizing that dissatisfaction, that anger, as part of the campaign, I didn't find surprising. I was surprised that it actually worked as well as it did. But then I was surprised when there was, and I would say until now, there still has not been any effort to broaden the base of people who chose him. And President Trump has, I don't know if this is a deliberate decision or if it's just he operates on gut instinct, and he seems to, and it got him to the White House, so you can't say that it's not worth anything. But he seems to be content with appealing to his base and not really trying much to broaden the base. And if that's what you're going to do, and he holds rallies, he holds political rallies. This is something no sitting president did. In fact, few presidents, even before they were elected, few candidates would hold the kind of rallies. But the idea of holding the rallies after you've been elected is something brand new. And the point of the rally seems to be to keep stoking that dissatisfaction with the status quo. Ronald Reagan did it to a certain degree. Even after 4 years as president, Reagan tried to run as the anti-establishment candidate. Boy, if you can pull it off, it's great, but it's hard to pull it off after you've been at the center of the establishment as president. So I don't know if this is a new model. So President Trump has been able to accomplish what he's accomplished with no observable sense of humor. Now, again, I don't know if he's a funny guy and tells jokes to the family or other people, but he seems to make, at least so far, make little or no effort to do it as president. Now, is this something new, or is this an aberration? As I get asked questions about the meaning of the Trump presidency fairly often, and my answer is to take the historian's dodge and say that it's too early to tell. And as I like to say, historians can really run with that a long way. So, Edward Gibbon, who wrote a six-volume history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which was published in the late 1700s. And it was describing events that had happened 1,000 years before. And he was once asked, so what is the lasting significance of Rome? And you know what he said? Too soon to tell. Well, but I can give you a date, a precise date on which it will be no longer too soon to tell. And that is Election Day 2020. And the reason I say this is that presidents who make a lasting mark on the American political system, who are elevated into the ranks of really important presidents, are exclusively those presidents who get reelected. The presidents for whom voters have a chance to vote on their performance. Presidents get elected the first time on the promise. And promise is one thing. You can be a persuasive promiser, but it doesn't always pay off. And maybe you don't deliver on your promises, or you change your mind or something. So I'm not going to say that anybody can get elected on the promise, but you can get elected on promises and not follow through. You get reelected on the performance. And any president who puts himself, and they're all hims until now, puts himself up for reelection, basically is asking for, well, in a British context, this would be a vote of confidence. And if voters reelect you by however small a margin, even if the second go-around in 2020 should be with a minority of the popular vote, we've got this set of rules, and if under those rules you win, then that says the American people liked what you did. Now, does it mean they like what you did in an absolute sense, in an ideal world? No. They only like you better than the person you're running against, but that's the standard in every election. Nobody gets to run sort of against nothing. You run against somebody else, and often votes are negative votes. We don't like the other scoundrel worse than this idiot. So, but nonetheless, if Donald Trump should get reelected and gets a second term, then pretty much all of the changes that he's announced, and changes to American foreign policy, changes to American domestic policy, those will have received the ratification of voters. And so then people like me will have to say, all right, something new and potentially permanent is going on. If, for whatever reason, he does not get a second term, if he runs and is defeated in the general election, if he's challenged in the primaries and loses, should he resign or be impeached and convicted? If he doesn't get a second term, then it will be entirely possible to say, okay, this was a one-time thing, and it represents the state of mind of voters at this particular moment. Because for me, whether it has to do with humor, whether it has to do with attitudes toward any number of things, presidents are less important for what they are than for what they represent. And one of the things they most represent is they are barometers of the political culture. As I said before, we get the presidents we deserve. And if voters say we like this new dispensation and it goes on, then there will have been this effective change of mind in the American political culture and the American electorate. And that is something that will be of lasting importance. So if you ask me in December 2020, I will no longer be able to say, too soon to tell. Please invite me back. But maybe let's make it, what would you say, April of 2021? May, okay, very good. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you all for coming.